In today's video, we're going to talk about tricky interview scenarios that could easily cost you if you're not prepared for them. You'll often find or hear of people who've had an interview that went badly and immediately the interview ended. For whatever reason, it was almost as if your brain started working. They could solve the problem clearly and quickly, and it becomes apparent that the interview was something they could pass, but something about the interview condition impaired their performance. A lot of the hiccups that occur in these types of interviews are manageable, so we're going to talk through some of them. The first one is an interrogation style interview. Some interviews do feel like interrogations. You'll experience rapid fire questions, and you'd easily be tempted to answer them as fast as possible. I'll advise you that you shouldn't do that. You should try and slow things down, even if you know the answer. Pause, take a deep breath, reflect on the answer, polish it, then respond. This helps you from being overwhelmed. This is your way of taking charge and slowing down the rapid fire. This is especially valuable if you have subsequent rounds, the same day or even, the next few days. You want to conserve your energy. You don't want to be mentally drained, for your interviews, especially if you have back-to-back interviews. Interviewers are notorious for throwing you off your train of thought. And tip here is you shouldn't be so polite and submissive that you let them dominate and ruin your chance. You should be ready to push back politely. And this is something you should have practiced. Otherwise, it could feel very awkward to do in a real interview. Simple phrases you can prepare to say are like, can you give me a moment, please? Hold that thought. I'm in the middle of doing X and Y. And that will make such a huge difference. Having to deal with losing your train of thought is actually part of a bigger challenge of the juggling act in an interview, which is this context switching you have to do between the different activities. You're managing time, making sure you don't run out of time. You're processing the body language of the interviewers, because sometimes that could give you hints as to whether you're wrong or you're on the right track. Sometimes it doesn't give you a hint. You're processing hints, like verbal hints from the interviewer. You're thinking of solutions to a problem. You're implementing the solution. You're reviewing your solution. You're maybe implementing the solution and handling questions midway. Interviewer could ask you, what's the runtime complexity of this library function you've used? There's a lot going on. It's quite demanding. And this is why interviews, even if you know your stuff and you could have answered the question, just due to the interview conditions, people struggle. And best advice for this is practice under these conditions during your mock interviews, ideally with a professional interviewer. Make sure you're in tip-top shape. Sleep being, I would say, probably the number one thing, where you're getting consecutive amount of high-quality sleep. And for some people, that's 7-8 hours of high quality sleep. Try and do that every day. You're fully energized, so depending on what your dietary restrictions are, you know what you can eat, but make sure you're fully energized. For me, it's low glycemic index carbs that gives me long lasting energy throughout the day. And I also actually recharge during the interview, so I'll have an energy source so I don't get tired midway. There's these demands, these extra demands in a real interview that typically make people blank out or have a brain freeze, even if they could well handle the challenges that were thrown at them, the technical challenges. So of course, like I said, the sleep, the diet, exercise as well, this helps, and for sure practicing all of these conditions. But if you happen to have anxiety, you could try things like chamomile tea, L-theanine. Some people take caffeine with L-theanine and calms them down without making them drowsy. Meditation. And if your anxiety is really bad, you definitely should seek medical advice so that it doesn't mess up your chances and ruin your career. By the way, if you like the advice so far, do give us a thumbs up, subscribe. Moving on. So another tricky scenarios where the interviewer is rushing you. It could be because the interviewer came late, or for some reason the interview started kind of late and the interviewer tries to rush you through the remaining time. I would advise that you refuse and try and reschedule that interview, unless for some reason it's that's going to be impossible. But if you're doing an interview under rush conditions, that's a huge disadvantage for you. Sometimes the interviewer is just rushing you for no reason. Maybe they're one of the folks who when they were interviewing, they memorize solutions and were regurgitating, but you might be facing a problem that you're unfamiliar with and you have to reason through things. So just do let them know you're thinking through things. In fact, most importantly, whenever you're given like a technical challenge, always ask how much time you have in the beginning, because I've just observed interviewers don't necessarily volunteer this information, but if you ask them, they're willing to tell. So this allows you to know how much time you have so you can manage your time. And if interviewers rushing you, disrupting your train of thought, push back politely, as mentioned before. Coding under pressure. Writing bug-free code is hard as it is. Doing this with someone breathing down your neck is orders of magnitude harder. And this is something that you really have to practice doing. So in your mock interviews, make sure you're practicing with someone breathing down your neck. And of course, with the time pressure, let whoever's ideally a professional interviewer, but it could be your friend, let them, ask you questions as you code. So you can practice, handling the pressure. There's nothing really better than the real thing. So if you can do like throwaway interviews, that'll probably be the best. But once you've done this a few times and you've succeeded, you will be less nervous. I'm not saying you wouldn't be nervous, but you'll be less nervous because you have the confidence from the fact that you've done this in the past and, succeeded. A big part of where nerves comes from, not only, but a big part of it is just the uncertainty, right? And another thing about coding in real interviews, some companies don't let you run your code. And I see a lot of people practicing, leak code where they're submitting multiple times and until they fix all the bugs and then they pass. But in a real interview, you should be trying to pass with the first time. So you need to incorporate that as well. Explaining your code. Now, communication skills are very important in technical jobs like software engineering. Explaining complex ideas to stakeholders is very important. In a lot of all these software engineering roles or firms, they're not so great at documentation, or let's just say everything isn't documented and people rely on each other for a huge amount of information. If you have someone in your team who doesn't explain things clearly, that's a huge impediment to your ability to get things done, to get the information you need. So a lot of teams are wary of this and they look out for people who communicate clearly. Unfortunately, some companies during interviews have a policy of not giving feedback, which means if you're not so great at explaining complex ideas clearly, or let's say in a coding interview explaining your code, you might not get that feedback and you wouldn't know to work on this and know how to improve. So in my experience, people that are not good at communication are not aware. So I'd ask you to practice this, and you have to practice it with someone else. Other people have to be able to understand what you're saying and give you feedback. And ultimately, you just need to get good at expressing yourself succinctly. So that means not being verbose, and coherently in a clear way that's easy for someone else to digest. Pair programming interviews. This is one style of interview that, if your interview preparation involves, solving algorithmic style problems on your own, you're definitely not preparing to handle these. These interviews can be awkward for several reasons. Sometimes they take place on a whiteboard, which means no autocomplete. So if you're addicted or used to autocomplete, please make sure you can do things, you can sketch out solutions to problems on paper or on text editors without autocomplete. Sometimes, these interviews really rely on, it could be like an ambiguous problem and you have to engage with the interviewer to extract information. So you have to consistently engage with the interviewer, share your thoughts, but not just anything that comes to your mind, but your reasoned thoughts. And you get feedback from the interviewer, and that kind of guides you in what direction you should be heading, let you know whether you're wrong or right, or whether you should recalibrate. You have to be used to asking clarifying questions because things can be ambiguous in terms of, say, requirements for a problem. So this is something you definitely need to actually practice doing. So you're working with the interviewer to solve a problem. I think the hardest variation of this is where there's some kind of requirement, some challenge, but there's a lot of restrictions to the problem. So it's not where you're given a problem and you can just solve it how you deem fit using your experience and things. Sometimes the problem is so constrained that maybe there's only like one way to solve it, and the interview is about seeing if you can get to that solution. These are really hard, and this is where the interviewer comes in, and you have to really engage with them so they can guide you on the right path. I think what I'll say is also the constraints are not always obvious from the get-go. So your intuition might fail you, and it's very important to get good at extracting the key information from the interviewer without coming across as dependent. So you have your thoughts, you organize your thoughts, and you express them to the interviewer. They see how you're thinking and they guide you. Something you should practice. Otherwise, if you do this for the first time in an interview, it could be tricky. What if your interviewer is rude? Sometimes you have the interview where the interviewer is just on their phone. They're frowning, they're being aggressive in terms of their tone and facial expression and mannerisms. Obviously, this is a huge red flag, and your first thought should be to consider pulling out of the process. You probably don't want to work in that team or company. But if it's a case where you have multiple rounds and you interview many teams, many people, then this one person could be a one-off, and it might be okay to tolerate. But if you're seeing this as a pattern in a certain organization, then you really want to reconsider if you want to work there. Another thing is, if they are rude to you in the interview, how will they treat you when you actually join the firm? There's two possibilities. There's cases where some interviews processes are harsh and they're just trying to weed out candidates who can't withstand that because maybe the conditions are high pressure, but maybe people actually treat their coworkers better. I can also hear some of you saying, but the total compensation is too high. I don't care if people are rude. I don't care if people treat me like shit. I need the money. If that's you, then you know what you're getting into, but just be prepared for the interviewers that might be rude. Don't let that throw you off. One last one, and I don't have a slide for this, but it's where the interviewer talks too fast or has an accent that's tricky to understand. Immediately you observe this, just let them know straight away. Don't be shy. It's not worth losing a job opportunity for. Typically, people who speak too fast or have a difficult to understand accent have gotten that feedback in the past. So if you just let them know, they'll most likely be willing to adapt. You're probably not the first person to tell them. And that's it, folks. So if you enjoyed this video, you found it useful, do hit the like button, subscribe. We're producing more videos, share, and I'll see you in another video.